Today on Communist Histories, we're returning to the politics of the northern warlords controlling China's legal government in Beijing. This is important not just because it provides background for the eventual conquest of the North by the nationalists, but because we can see the development of key themes in China at the time. The rise of anti-imperialism outside of specifically nationalist and communist circles, and connected to that, the greater conflicts between foreign powers in China. I've been focusing on developments in the south for the last few episodes, so I want to begin by briefly recapping the northern situation. Cao Kun, the leader of the Zhili clique, and Zhang Zuolin, the leader of the northeastern Feng Yuxiang clique, seized power together following the 1920 Anhui-Zhili War. Their coalition government quickly fell apart, and the Zhili and Feng Yuxiang cliques went to war. Due to the brilliant maneuvering of Cao Kun's top general, Wu Peifu, the war lasted only about a month, resulting in Zhang Zuolin retreating to his power base in the northeast. The Zhili clique became the sole governing organization in Beijing, and after a failed attempt at ruling through a puppet government, Cao Kun became known through the country as the bribing president after paying members of parliament to put him directly in charge. Cao didn't have any real goals for his rule. He was largely a figurehead, with Wu Peifu handling most of the day-to-day governing. And for a period of almost 6 months, there were no major political machinations. Things were relatively stable. But of course, it couldn't last. When Zhang Zuolin fled with his army back to the northeast, he didn't just resign himself to staying there for good. He immediately set to rebuilding his army to make a comeback. And he looked to Japan to make that happen. The Zhili clique was the most anti-Japanese group to rule China in years. They were allied more with Britain. So the Japanese government was happy to establish more presence in the northeast. Japan loaned Zhang tons of money, which was used to develop the northeast into the most industrialized region of China. The Feng Qian put a heavy focus on building railroads and developed its own currency, the Feng Piao Yuan, which was stronger than the rest of China's. The biggest developments were in arms production. The new Mukden arsenal was able to supply a modern army of 250,000 men with new artillery, small tanks, and even a small air force, leagues beyond anything the rest of China's warlords had at hand. Zhang also fired many of the generals who had lost the war with Zhili, and promoted a new generation of officers, including his son, the young marshal, Zhang Shuiliang. And he developed a centralized logistics command to use the new railroads to bring supplies and reinforcements to battles. The Feng Yuxiang clique was prepared to make its return. It just needed to wait for the right moment. In August 1924, war broke out in Shanghai. It was a regional conflict. Two local warlords both felt entitled to the prosperous city. The fighting was short and uneventful. One side's troops were quickly bribed to go home. However, one of the warlords was allied to the Zhili clique, and the other to the Feng Yuxiang. So even though the fighting was already over, Zhang Zuolin seized upon the excuse to go to war with Cao Kun, and his troops marched back south. The war shortly became a stalemate. While the Feng Yuxiang armies were better trained and equipped, the Zhili army was larger, and Wu Peifu was a better general than anybody on Zhang's side. The stalemate broke after about a month, when one of Wu Peifu's top commanders and a hero of the First War, Feng Yuxiang, changed sides along with the entire front he was leading. With no other Zhili armies nearby, Feng was able to turn around and march his entire army to Beijing. He arrested and deposed Cao Kun, with almost no resistance. Wu Peifu was in the field with the Zhili armies, and suddenly found himself surrounded. Forced to withdraw, Wu fled south to maintain Zhili control in central China, though with only a fraction of its power before the war. Meanwhile, Feng Yuxiang and Zhang Zuolin formed a new coalition in Beijing. Feng Yuxiang was known nationwide as the Christian General, as he had become a Baptist in his youth. He included Bible studies in the military training of his troops, and famously, allegedly, baptized all of his men with a fire hose. We can also call Feng the nickname general, because he had so many of them. He was known as the Betrayal General, for obvious reasons that will only become more obvious, as well as the Red General, because he was sympathetic towards the Kuomintang, which was seen in northern propaganda as an entirely communist-run organization. Feng was so fond of the GMD that upon seizing power, he renamed his army the Kuomintang, Nationalist Army, and he entered into negotiations with Sun Jiangshan, although they didn't actually come to anything before Sun died. Feng Yuxiang was not interested in joining the Fengtian clique. He had turned on Cao Kun out of his own self-interest. So control of Beijing was split once more. Feng and Zhang Zuolin decided to establish a neutral puppet government, and to lead it they chose the one man guaranteed to hate all the other cliques equally, Duan Qirui of the Anhui clique. Since being defeated by the Zhili and Fengtian cliques in the 1920 war, Duan's clique had shrunk to just a small number of personal bodyguards. Duan was so poor at this point that he couldn't afford a house and had to live with one of his soldiers. But he was still an experienced politician, and he tried to use his new position to play Feng and Zhang off of each other, framing his installment as Provisional Chief Executive as a new revolution. It wasn't a very successful move, though. By this point, people in the north had become very cynical about new governments, and Duan was never able to take power in his own right. After taking power, Feng Yuxiang became more radical and openly supportive of the Kuomintang. He was encouraged in this by the Soviet Union, which began sending him arms and instructors, with the hope that he might officially join up with the government in Guangzhou. In Feng's most radical act, he finally expelled ex-Emperor Pu Yi from the Forbidden City, where he had been living on a government stipend since the revolution 13 years earlier, and officially revoked his titles and made him a private citizen. Pu Yi fled to the Japanese concession in Tianjin. The Soviet Union's support for Feng increased tensions between him and Zhang Zuolin, an ardent anti-communist. To counter Feng's control of Shanxi province, Zhang expanded Fengtian control into the parts of central China where Wu Peifu was weakest. And to offset Feng's Soviet help, and the devaluation of the Feng Piao Yuan after the war, Zhang received more aid from Japan. Zhang was often portrayed in public propaganda as a Japanese puppet, although the situation was a little more complicated than that. The Japanese government wanted to help oppose Soviet influence in China, but only to a degree. Uchiyama Kiyoshi, the Japanese consul general in Mukden, worried that the greatest problem for Japan would be if Zhang became so strong that he might no longer rely on our support. So they helped, but their aid was limited, and Zhang had no intention of limiting his power to keep them happy. The greatest conflict during the Feng-Jiang regime came in June 1925, in Shanghai. Most of Shanghai was under control of foreign powers, the British, Americans, and Japanese in the international settlement, and the French in their own concession. It was the commercial and industrial heart of China, with the largest industrial working class population in the country. So, after the founding of the United Front, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party both made it a center of their organizing work. In February 1925, the CCP led a strike of workers at the Japanese-owned No. 8 mill of the Nagai Wata Kaisha, and formed the Shanghai Cotton Mill Union. This conflict developed for months, until May 15th, when the worker Gu Zhenhong was shot by a Japanese foreman. This got the attention of Shanghai's student population, who held a memorial ceremony for Gu on May 24th. Afterwards, 4 students were arrested by the International Settlement Police for distributing pamphlets generating disaffection among the workers. The students were scheduled to go to trial on May 30th, and the Communists and the Kuomintang convinced the Shanghai Students' Federation to stage a protest. At the same time, the Municipal Council of the International Settlement was proposing 4 bills, which were up for vote on June 2nd. These 4 bills would increase wharfage dues, enact press controls, regulate the stock exchange, and regulate child labor. While none of these were of much interest to Shanghai's workers, the Chinese merchants were incensed, and the students saw an opportunity to build an alliance. On May 30th, students went into the streets in groups to give speeches decrying the killing of Gu, the arrest of the students, and the passing of the 4 bills by a government with no Chinese representation. Across the city, protesters were arrested. But in one case, in front of the Nanjing Road Police Department, the crowd pushed back against the cops. As the people approached the police station, British Inspector Evanson ordered his men to fire on the crowd. 13 people died, while 20 were seriously wounded, in what became known as the May 30th massacre. Immediately afterwards, the CCP held a meeting at the house of Zhang Guotao, the commissioner of the Central Committee. In attendance were Chen Duxiu, Li Lisan, Liu Shaoqi, and Cai Hussun. The CCP decided to push for a general strike against imperialism. To help organize it, the party planned to unify Shanghai's many trade unions into a single Shanghai General Labor Union. Due to his successes organizing an Anyuan, the task of establishing this SGLU went to Li Lisan, who soon became its leader. By June 5th, over 170 unions had joined. Following the students' lead in gathering support of the Chinese merchants, the CCP made a point of ensuring that the strike would touch only foreign-owned businesses. With this assurance, and still angry about the 4 bills, the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce supported the strike, encouraging merchants to close their stores and contributing money to the strike fund. Students returned to the streets, giving speeches to explain the situation to the workers, and passing out the propaganda pamphlet, Xie Chao, Tide of Blood. The Guomindang Women's Department staged a play about the murder of Gu Junheng. Initially, the strike was very successful. Foreign companies had to divert shipping from Shanghai, as nobody was working the wharves. Feng Yuxiang was even compelled to call for war against the UK, saying, "We should be willing to shed the blood of our 200,000 men in order to deliver China from the yoke of the imperialist powers, and, incidentally, to free the oppressed peoples of the whole world. Let us make the first move, and I'm sure the rest will follow. In death there shall be glory for us. God had a special mission for us when he ordained that we should live at this time, instead of 50 years ago or 50 years later. He wants us to fight the forces of evil." Nobody really took him seriously, and nothing came of it. But the international settlement's response was hard. A state of emergency was declared on June 1st, and during the period of the strike, over 60 Chinese people were killed and 70 wounded by police. They raided the city's universities and expelled the students. Worse, after about a week, the Chinese merchants began to realize how much money they were losing. On June 11th, they convinced the strikers to lower their demands. And on June 21st, the Chamber of Commerce officially retracted its support and encouraged businesses to reopen, having achieved none of their demands. Without merchant support, the strike fund ran out in July, and Zhang Zuolin finally stepped in, sending soldiers to help suppress the protesters. He saw the movement as a Soviet Kuomintang-Kuomintang plot. Tide of Blood and some unions were shut down, and the SGLU had to go underground. But even as the students and merchants gave up, workers continued striking for months, and the Nagai Watakasha mill finally gave in and recognized the cotton mill union and ended no-cause firing in mid-August. Finally, in September, the rest of the city went back to work. The SGLU remained an underground organization, with Li Lisan a wanted man. But the May 30th movement wasn't seen as a loss for everybody. Because the leadership of the international settlement was almost entirely British, the American president of Yanqing University, John Leighton Stewart, saw the movement as a superlative opportunity for America to vie for leadership in China. The May 30th movement brought the divisions between Feng Yuxiang and Zhang Zuolin to the fore. Feng's increasing radicalism convinced Zhang that he was a communist, and that if he didn't act, sooner or later Beijing will be filled with Reds. Both sides knew war was inevitable. Sun Chunfang was a Zhili warlord who controlled Nanjing, and whose territory bordered the Fengtian clique. Sun wanted to expand, and in November 1925, he attacked. Feng Yuxiang saw his opportunity. He made a deal with Sun that after Zhang went south to attack Sun, Feng would attack from the rear and cut off his supplies. But when Zhang did march south, Feng declared war on him and occupied some territory, but didn't actually attack. Presumably, Feng hoped that Sun Chunfang and Zhang Zuolin would destroy each other, leaving Feng the sole power. He miscalculated. Zhang Zuolin hated Feng Yuxiang much more than he cared about some distant counties. He immediately made peace with Sun, letting him keep the territories, and headed north. Worse, since he was already near Zhili territory, Zhang made peace with Wu Peifu, who also hated Feng Yuxiang more than anything, and the two joined up in what Zhang called an anti-red campaign to destroy Feng. Zhang and Wu retook Beijing quickly. Duan Qurui was deposed, and Zhang finally just put himself in charge. Feng was clearly losing the war, but the rest of his territory was in mountainous Shanxi province, which allowed him to slow down the enemy advance. And as it happened, buying time was all Feng needed to do, because there was another power in China that was finally ready to advance. The Kuomintang was marching north. We'll return to the Kuomintang and the background of the Northern Expedition next time. Thanks for watching.